What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Apartment 113 podcast, where we talk with cool folks in the cannabis and psychedelics industry to learn about their projects and celebrate their successes. My name is Rob Sanchez, and this is episode 79. We're joined today by Gary Laderman, a Goodrich C. White Professor of American Religious History and Cultures for the Department of Religion at Emory College of Arts and Sciences. He has written 7 books, including The Sacred Remains, Rest in Peace, A Cultural History of Death in the Funeral Home in 20th Century America, Sacred Matters, and Don't Think About Death, a memoir on mortality. The 8th book of his is almost done. It will be titled Sacred Drugs, covering drugs from pharmaceuticals to psychedelics and everything in between, along with their use and connection to religion and culture. The book shares a name with the course he's teaching at Emory. He spoke recently at Psycon in Las Vegas about psychedelics and psychoactive substances as sacred sources of meaning and religious life for society. We dig into all things sacred when it comes to psychedelics and change at the individual and societal levels on this one. Find his books on Amazon or a bookstore near you and learn more at GaryLaderman.com. Enjoy the show. Gary, welcome to the show, man. It's good to have you join.
It is great to be here. I'm glad I got the invitation and that we'll have a chance to talk.
Yes, I thoroughly enjoyed your session at Psycon in Vegas last month. It was enlightening for sure. There was many sessions throughout the whole conference. I felt like I was in school, basically, just taking notes in the back. But it was very kind of like thought-provoking, kind of what you were talking about with sacred drugs and with great awakenings in American culture, that it had me thinking about that, honestly, into the next sessions.
That's excellent. And that was a fun conference to be a part of and a sign of the excitement that's happening. I wasn't able to stay too long, but I got to tour a little bit. And I'm glad that, it connected with you and seemed to connect with some of how you received the other panels and papers and communications.
Right. Yeah, it was intriguing to think of it as a great awakening, either happening now or just right around the corner. Would you like to explain a little bit about this new book before we dive into the old ones, or should we build up to it?
Well, we can start with the sacred drugs. It's completely up to you either way.
Excellent.
I'm at the moment, trying to write about this notion of great awakening and psychedelics, and so it's certainly in my at the forefront of my mind at the moment. So if you want to go there, we can start.
Hey, awesome. Yeah. So sacred drugs and the Great Awakening. Essentially, it's America's reliance, even maybe unacknowledged, on psychedelics, and maybe on the even like pre-America times with psychedelics in the States. Where is the first Great Awakening, if we start there?
It's a lot to unpack, and I'll take a step back and just say a little bit about the book and sort of sacred drugs. Basically, the book is tied to a course I teach called Sacred Drugs that I teach here at Emory. And it really looks at the basic level at the connection between religion and drugs, and the multiple connections that exist between religion and drugs throughout human histories and around the globe in different cultures. And the spectrum of drugs I am focusing on are really primarily psychoactive substances. So everything from coffee to LSD and cannabis, everything in between, including pharmaceuticals and psychoactive prescription drugs. So it really looks at what others have written about, but I think is pretty obvious, and that we're a pretty drugged out country. And human history is full of substances that have a drugging effect that seem to play an important role in society and culture. So I am trying to look at America which has had all kinds of struggles and troubles around drugs, as a another culture that relies very much on psychoactive substances for life, for living, for a sense of identity, for senses of community, and other kind of important religious components. So, we can maybe talk about some of those other possibilities as we go on. But I'm also focusing on psychedelics. It's one of the chapters, and it's really in psychedelics and its history that I am trying to apply this notion of a great awakening.
Okay.
I'll try to be. I'll be brief. But basically, in American religious history, there are these periods that are identified as great awakenings, periods in which there's a great spiritual enthusiasm and ongoing revivals that are instrumental in shaping people's religious identities, as well as reflecting and connecting to the nation and national identity. So in American religious history, these great awakenings, especially really the first three, are obviously tied to white evangelical Protestantism, right? So those first awakenings were very tied into the cultural power and expansion of evangelicalism. White, but also African American for sure, who are very much a part of these awakenings, and whose religious identities are transformed, as well. So, there's a lot of detail there that I don't need to get into, but the notion here is that we are in the midst of two great psychedelic awakenings, I think. And very quickly, the first one really erupts, obviously, in the 1960s and is, pretty immediately shut down, with the war on drugs becoming this kind of formal militaristic domestic policy. And but of course, psychedelics don't go away. They become part of the underground, if you will, or not as
Indeed.
visibly public and present as they were in the 60s. And then, that ultimately leads to this second great psychedelic awakening, which we're in the midst of right now, and that really begins in the 1990s, early 2000s. But that, again, is an ongoing psychedelic revival that I think is also having a great impact on people's sense of their religious identity, as well as, as I try to write about in this book, like psychedelics and this great awakening obviously is making an impact on individual consciousnesses and altering individual consciousnesses and everything that is connected with those experiences. But the awakening is also, has made an impact on our collective consciousness and altered our collective consciousness around drugs, around religion, around spirituality. So there is interesting cultural linkages between the psychedelic awakening and how the religious landscape is shifting in the 20th and 21st century.
Interesting. Yeah. And that's, so basically as folks have explored themselves with psychedelia or found changes in their own personal lives, that's had that rippling effect over time to kind of create the community changes or the societal changes. And those then have, you think, well, do they impact the religion, or those have been adjacent to the religiosity or the sacred all this time?
They are the sacred. It is religious. And even that sense of, transformation, understanding new aspects of one's self and consciousness, these I would conceptually tie into aspects of religious life.
It's the
Whether they
same kind of sacredness or that heaven or the divinity that folks in different religious sects or religious traditions would pray for or look to for inspiration or even meditate to reach. I feel like there's a lot of similarities I can see there.
absolutely. I mean, and I'm not the only one to bring these connections out and try to highlight them. But I mean, I think it's very much what you're talking about. These are different sources for sacrality, for religious life. And sometimes those are obvious and explicit. So we can talk about, um, peyote and the Native American church, obviously religious, tied in to psychedelics.
It's actually in what we would consider a church setting right
Right.
from the beginning.
And the peyote is sacred. It's a sacrament. So that's clearly, obviously religious kinds of activities and so on. But then, you also have more free floating spiritual dimensions to life that aren't necessarily in an institutional setting, but that still, can be generated or activated by someone tripping on LSD or mushrooms. Um,
Turn a few light bulbs on there, maybe turn one
yeah,
off.
exactly. And that kind of awakening, again, has religious resonances. And yeah, I'll be maybe a typical academic. I mean, I don't want to say those religious resonances are the same for everyone all the time and with every psychedelic. But for many, at certain times, tripping can produce religious uh, orientations, responses, consequences that are, I mean, that are not similar to, but they're the same as someone who experiences the Holy Spirit and is converted by
Right.
Jesus, and that conversion experience, transformation, new sense of identity, new sense of orientation, maybe new community.
Kind of doing away with any past actions they're not happy with at that time, or having been forgiven for a sin, perhaps, so they can move forward fresh. I could see some relation there with integration and kind of psychedelic healing too.
Well, you're right on. I mean, I'm coming at all this as you mentioned in my introduction, from religious studies. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a sociologist. I am not a theologian. I'm interested in religious aspects of culture, and so I'm not conceptually limited to the Bible or
Right.
Hindu scripture or something. I mean, people are religious in a variety of ways, and those ways change with culture. And I think our culture, as I've said, is very drug influenced. And while we might not recognize the religious qualities of our being drugged, um, again, it can be spelled out in very obvious ways. Um, or, I think in less obvious ways that I hope are still persuasive. Just the ritual of, smoking a joint in the morning as a way not to have some kind of mystical, transcendent experience, but to get grounded and to help establish kind of order in the universe that is, kind of not tied to the extraordinary aspects of religious life, but more about,
Right.
I got to stay sane and get through the day. But again, I'm not reducing it to simply this kind of functional equivalent of some kind of aspirin or something. I mean, for
Yeah,
many
it's kind
people,
of
it
still
does.
has that ritual nature to it, that preparation or that intention that's going in, rolling and preparing and kind of working through the process. Definitely some inner thoughts, some reflection being done.
Absolutely, and that can happen with cannabis for sure, or with someone's antidepressant. These are still these
Yeah.
sort of daily rituals for some people that for some people can tie into these more spiritual aspects of life that also bleed into
Right.
psychological, that also bleed into biological. This is we've got to find new ways to think about the religious aspects of our lives, I think.
Yeah. So kind of those religious or the threads connecting perhaps like that morning joint to the um, Sunday mass or to worshiping at the mosque is are the similar things there are order and meaning, a kind of an appreciation or a connection to the community. Is that really where the grounding is at for drug use or for the different things folks do in their religions or in their search for religions?
I think that may be an aspect of it.
I see.
And,
Yeah.
that's the great thing about studying religious life. Of course, it's varied. And,
Yeah.
and I certainly don't, and this may shock some people, as a professor of religion, I sure the hell don't have a definition of religion that I think
It's
applies all the time, everywhere, for everyone.
a moving target, huh?
Totally. And so
Yeah.
that's a bit destabilizing, but I also think we're all religious. I think search for meaning, community, sense of identity, search for transcendence. There are all kinds of aspects of human life, existential aspects, suffering, death, ecstasy, that can help again sort of generate and bring to life religious spiritual sensibilities that aren't necessarily, you know, this is all Eve's fault or something.
Monotheistic traditions and things like that. Yeah. And that's very intriguing. And in some way then is it anything that people do can have that reflection? Like actually anything? Mowing the yard regularly?
That's
Or is there a line there somewhere where it's like, no, that's just a functional thing. You have to do that, or the HOA is coming for you.
right. Well, that's obviously a key question, and I get it a lot. But yeah, the idea is that it isn't necessarily the case that everything is religious, but I think anything can be religious.
Uh,
Now, the mowing the lawn, again, I don't know how that ties into community, ties into sort of generating identity. Um, I don't, as someone who's trained in kind of history and thinking about social and cultural aspects of religion, I'm
yeah,
not so interested in like the individual and their subjective experience of what counts as religious.
I see.
Religion
Yeah.
is always social. I mean, even if you go out and, worship nature by yourself, that's part of certainly a social, cultural um, effort that,
So
doesn't isolate
community
the
is key.
individual.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are ties into larger communities that, again, can, you know, signify religious life and activity, but not everything necessarily is going to have those signifiers or those markers.
I see. Right. And as far as the psychedelic side and kind of the sacredness or the sacrality that could, should, and is there, maybe it's just unrecognized by folks for what it is. Are there historical kind of catalysts for that got us to where we are now? Like that first awakening from the '60s, was that the seed being planted, or is it actually even farther back in the histories of, like you mentioned, the Protestant culture of like the origins of America and things like that?
Yeah. Yeah, really great, loaded questions. A lot, lot to
I'm
say,
great at
but
those
I'll
questions.
keep it. Yeah, right. I'll just try to be brief. But yes, I do. I think there are all kinds of antecedents, things that sort of have led to this point. Um, and to your first point, right on. I don't necessarily assume everyone will agree with me or see these religious strands as I'm trying to kind of highlight them. Um, but I also, if I haven't said it before, think very strongly that people are religious in ways that they may not recognize. So, just in terms of like the historical flow of your question, is like, I think, again, helps set the stage. Um, but try to go backwards here. There's a way in which the current great psychedelic awakening is, just all framed and fueled by science, by psychology, by therapy, a whole different conceptual framework within which to work with psychedelics and to argue for their benefits. So it's very, for the most part, pretty clinical.
Right, right. And we've seen in kind of in Colorado and Oregon the way that the industry is rolling out is all around clinical healing. It's around therapy, integration with a trained specialist. It's not necessarily taking some mushrooms in your backyard, riding it
Right.
out.
Which, I think in many circumstances is the right thing to do. But still, I mean, yeah, you're right. There's so much else going on around psychedelics, but this sort of clinical therapeutic MAPS push is what is part of, really making it an awakening and helping to, um, again, sort of bring a certain kind of lens to the psychedelic phenomena that is um, can be more legitimate for people, can be more safely kind of embraced when it comes through the scientific medical uh, blender.
Right. It's kind of some trappings over the same beast to make it more acceptable or show its benevolence actual in light rather than potential insanity or other things previously associated.
100%. I mean, I think that's exactly right, even though what's underneath is still sacred, religious, has those powers, as well as exactly what you're talking about. Because when I want to talk about the sacred and religious life, I mean, it's not all, glory and ecstasy and constructive, benefits for society. It's also destruction. It's also um, chaos. Said the sacred can also generate hatred and bloodshed and carnage, as we know through history. So,
Right.
the sacred is double-edged, and there are those components. And so, I want to, yeah, sort of emphasize the point that you made, and thinking about what is being covered up and put into this new packaging. But so the point, though, for sure, is that the first Great Awakening was, although obviously there were these clinical therapeutic elements to the 1950s, late 1950s and
Right.
1960s.
CIA was up to some stuff, huh?
Lots of interest in what these new drugs might do to the mind. But then there was Timothy Leary, and then it was the 60s. And this, the psychedelic, the first psychedelic Great Awakening ain't about therapy and PTSD. It's about let's change the fucking world. Let's
Right.
change consciousness. It was deeply and directly a kind of religious force that was part of this explosion, and that was dominant. And again, what led to this more public awareness, awakening of the power of these psychedelic drugs. So, of course, that was shut down immediately with Nixon and everything about the war on drugs and everything, which we can get into, that represented and was seen especially as a threat to the status quo for obvious reasons.
Which was
But so
almost an
that I think
acknowledgement,
that's
huh?
say again.
It was almost an acknowledgement then of that power of that sacredness.
Exactly, it was very much so, and why it was so urgent to shut it down for again the sort of conservative forces in terms of the societal status quo. Um,
Right.
but there were, also other elements as well that led to the shutdown. But again, I think that experience led to a very different second round of psychedelic awakening that was certainly, again, for a number of reasons that have to do with historical and cultural context of the late 1990s and early 2000s, where psychedelics were, kind of able to explode on the scene, but again, more in this safer, therapeutic, scientific framework.
And in between those awakenings, psychedelia is just hanging on the underbelly of society
Yes.
the whole time.
Well, and that's
In
what's exciting.
warehouses and basements and
Right, and that's hard to get to, for as a historian. It's like, although there are people and books that are being written about how psychedelia lives in
yeah,
70s, 80s, and 90s.
right. Like, or how it wasn't forgotten or somehow lost after that after that initial shutdown.
Absolutely. I mean, even though the clampdown is there, you can't, and so it does still find its way in different communities, and that's fascinating too. Whether we're talking about Black psychedelia, or looking at comic book culture, there's all kinds of these little subcultural communities that are tied into to the vibrancy of psychedelia
Yeah, where
during those years.
someone
Um,
had an experience and ended up getting very creative because of it or wanted to share that into their works. I think on the comic side, you can see all the Marvel guys. I mean, there's stories of them just tripping on LSD while wandering around the city, going back and working on their pages in the nighttime. I mean, they were definitely bringing some of that imagery and kind of change that comes from it is almost like the hero's journey that they would retell again and again across their character portfolio.
that's excellent. I'm going to footnote you for sure. When writing the book, that's great. That's excellent. Um, but surely, yeah, that, I mean, yeah, Grateful Dead. There's a great book out on the history of blotter paper. You've seen that? This guy, Eric Davis, who may be someone you may want to talk to eventually.
Oh man! So actually, the all the different blotter paper that was used throughout the eras.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
a real kind of excavation of that.
Yeah.
Like, okay, what is there to that? But it's there's a lot to it. Um, So yeah, I mean that's part of the fun, is trying to disentangle all those threads. And then what's really interesting, whether we get into it or not, is trying to think, okay, what was happening with psychedelics before the 60s, before the 50s, what early 20th century, and how do we map out some psychedelic terrain
Right. Yeah.
that
Which
was there,
which
no doubt.
cultures are which cultures are the kind of high points there, or the big ones before that?
Yeah, and that there's not much. I mean, if you get off, if I may, the kind of reservation, and think about peyote as it exists for native peoples, um,
Right.
and how that starts to spread beyond those boundaries. And I've been reading about peyote parties at Harvard, with Harvard aesthetes, and very small little avant-garde groups that are getting their hands on mescaline in some form or other. So,
Right.
and
Or
then
like the
nitrous oxide
ayahuasca. Yeah. That's where I
is
was
in.
going from, like the Peruvian tribes and folks in Central America. Huh?
Well, I mean, you can go certainly farther back in the Americas, with all kinds of psychedelic, hallucinogenic plant life, as a part of the again, America's landscape. Um, but beyond that, ayahuasca or some of these plant-based psychedelics, you know, there was no LSD. I mean, certainly nitrous oxide, after its discovery, um, was was used for various reasons
Right.
that didn't have to do with kind of medical anesthesia. And William James, was obviously one of the more famous figures who helped to bring the connection between nitrous oxide and drugs and religious life. So
So he was religious himself, and was he religious himself? Do you know? And then that the nitrous kind of matched the divinity that he was already aware of in some way, or I wonder if he started without it and found that.
William James is a great philosopher figure, and he was a skeptic. He wasn't.
I see.
And struggled with his religion. His great book is called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he tries to. This is like early 1900s or late 19th century, but where he tries to look at both, the positive, optimistic aspects of religion and the negative, more troubling aspects. And so that's a kind of standard book. But the nitrous oxide allowed him to experience this mystical experience, and that was fundamental and foundational for him in terms of his religious outlook, his philosophical outlook. And it's through his writings that we, I think, even today, have a language to talk about mysticism generally, but also as we see it in the so-called psychedelic Renaissance, where a lot of the discussion around the mystical aspect of the patient's experiences are tied into the kind of formula that James put forward around, the psychedelic experience, the mystical experience, I should say.
Right.
And it's inexpressible. It's noetic. You have some great knowledge. So, in some
it's
ways,
that moving target again, huh?
well, right, totally. But also his framework and his writings around this, in many ways, I think, contributed to the to the set and setting of
kind of setting the stage
yes.
for future generations to build their thoughts on, and for folks to explore that same lens.
Absolutely, and as you say, to kind of rely on the same kind of language that has certain kinds of conceptual associations that that may be accurate and useful, but that also may constrain in some ways. How we're able to sort of really process some of these mystical aspects of psychedelic experience.
And how do you see, the future of this great awakening? If we've kind of went into the past a little bit, what about like kind of projecting forward, from what you've seen and kind of what you're studying, is it exponential at this point? Are we maybe in for some more bumpy roads along the way?
That is the question, and
you got to pull off the cover on your crystal ball.
I'd start buying stocks, maybe. Certainly, just the whole capitalist industrializing of psychedelics is a sign of the future.
Yes, maybe an ambivalent one.
Well, sure, for sure. I mean, we don't have to get into the history of the pharmaceutical industry to get into.
And your book, Sacred Drugs, is covering pharmaceuticals as well as psychedelics, as well as, you said, coffee, everything else that folks drug themselves up with, whether it be benign and mundane, in quotes, the way we think of the cup of coffee here, or life-changing, like an ayahuasca journey. How do those other drugs find a footing in this great awakening? Or is it limited to the psychedelia side of things?
Yeah, that's good. I am really limiting it to the psychedelic side in terms of the story I'm trying to tell about sacred drugs.
I see.
I think there may be ripple effects, but I suppose I would respond by saying, like, um, drugs have been a constant in American history. There's no need for an awakening when alcohol is always available, or at least
Right.
for most of history. Or cigarettes used to be much more readily available. Coffee, our reliance on prescription drugs, now cannabis. Um, Psychedelics, again, seems to have more of this roller coaster, I suppose. Obviously, when thinking about just the recent whatever past.
There's more impact on the self, so more impact on society, and kind of scales up, huh? With
Absolutely.
psychedelics versus penicillin or ADHD medicine that's kind of
Yeah.
sweeping the nation, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think there does seem to be more at stake and more loaded into psychedelics than we might associate with Zoloft or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe like you're saying, scales for sure. Um, but psychedelics again seem to be on a very distinctive path in some ways, and I think just part of that, as you're saying, has to do with what they do to people, um, and how do people then sort of make sense of those experiences. Um, we don't have a shaman to help guide us through the cosmic, the psychological, the spiritual, the physical, right? Where the trip wasn't about this aspect of your psychological life, right? Or whatever. I don't, not to minimize that, but I'm just saying,
Yeah.
how the language, concepts, practices we have to make sense of these experiences I think, are still in flux.
We
Even
haven't quite
though,
found we haven't found like a solid ground there, or maybe there's not a solid ground if it's so subjective.
and I think that may be exactly right. There may not be, and to imagine that there's really only one way to use psychedelics is also in its own way going to be counterproductive,
Right.
um, given what they can do for people.
Kind of
Whether
microdosing versus macro, or using for certain kind of intentions, right? The setting and that intention part of it.
Yeah, I mean, very much so, and with whom, and the sort of community that helps to allow for processing and thinking about impact on identity and so on. Yeah, I think all those things are still in a lot of ways in play, um, as psychedelics just become more popular is not uh, strong enough. I mean, they are seeping
Yeah.
into our cultural consciousness in ways that are
In the
leading
zeitgeist.
people. What's you say again?
Kind of in the zeitgeist, or in
In the
the
zeitgeist
mindset. Yeah.
and in the mindset, and not just sort of hanging there in the abstract, but like, I got to try this, or my microdose, or your different social media now has all kinds of advertisements for different kinds of mind and mood altering substances.
Yeah, and I feel like there's been such a focus, an increased focus on kind of the music scene, even more than the 60s and 70s. It feels with like a lot of young kids coming back, or maybe very similar to that, with like a lot of youths finding themselves, or finding their access, or their fun, for lack of better words, in like EDM and bass music, kind of rave festival events and things like that have really gotten traction. And I mean, when I was first going to them, it didn't seem like something that was advertised on social media at all. It was kind of like you heard about this event, you needed to bring a tent there, and you found out a lot once you got there. And now it feels like scrolling through, like, oh, what the heck? These are all over the place.
Yeah,
Every state has them. They're happening all year.
yeah.
It's kind of wild.
Yeah, it's wild and a bit uncontrollable. It's not within the limitations of a clinical trial.
I totally, yeah. And that's maybe more why that's maybe that sharper edge that that the U.S. was a little more, a little too eager to shut down in the '60s and '70s.
Yeah. Well, the zeitgeist is so different, and we are in some strange transition um, around the war on drugs and trying to sort of question what the hell that has meant and what that has done to all of us.
Really looking
Um,
now that we've been fighting the war for so long, we can look behind us at the battles to see, what the impacts were, or maybe analyze them a little bit better now from our armchairs, huh?
well, and hopefully make it better into the, for the future.
Yeah,
Without question, is some sanity in thinking about, how we face the fact as a country uh, that we love drugs.
yeah,
And we,
yeah.
we
That's
love, we want to alter our consciousness. Again, not always for the same intention, not for the same reason. And certainly for many people, it can, be unhealthy, if not deadly. So not again to go back to the book, but in the sacred drugs class and in the book,
yeah,
there's definitely a chapter on addiction. Addiction as the other side of our religious devotion to drugs that can also have its own religious qualities and resonances that are still very tied into psychoactive substances, even though it's more of the
right.
demonization side or trying to get saved from.
Yeah, and some psychedelics can definitely bring in addictive qualities to them, or certain mindsets, certain kind of more hedonistic, maybe for lack of better words, communities kind of create that stage where it's more of a constant, it's more of a necessity. Like ketamine is one that actually does have the addictive tendencies. In the in the music circles, it can be known as more polite things and fun things like kitty cat, or also hippie crack, because of that kind of draw or that that pull
Yeah,
that's almost unavoidable.
yeah, that's I'm interested in that pull and that sort of magnetic quality to sacred sources.
Right.
And again, not that that's always going to lead you to God or the divine, but also can lead to, as you were just saying, things that might um, lead to all kinds of
Into the
self-harm or
storm.
harm of others, or yeah, yeah, exactly. Um,
So the tools, and in your lecture, you were talking about how psychedelics were a sacred tool used by different cultures or different religions at points in society, and now that tool almost is being picked up by this modern capitalistic materialistic approach. That's the concern, I think, and that's what really had me thinking about it after your class, and like how will we handle this tool? And it on one hand, was thinking it seems like that's the perfect tool for capitalism to pick up because it kind of cuts the foundations out of the kind of ego and mentality that might feed into capitalism too strongly or might make it that kind of negative thing at times. But on the other hand, we've seen it thrive in through all kinds of things. I don't know if just a little tool is going to upset it.
right. Well, I think that there was enough fear that that tool could upset capitalism in the 60s that it required a kind of major effort to shut down those experiences. And that's, again, part of how people describe their psychedelic experiences. And others who have written about the period have talked about it as well. As an aspect of psychedelics is to see through the the veil, to see through the
Yeah.
lies, to kind of see capitalism for what it is, and to question it, and to really kind of um, throw the blinders off. and that sense of social transformation that was tied into the psychedelics and psychedelic culture of the 60s again was part of the Great Fear, anti-capitalist. And what you're saying is right on for today, though, where I think, yeah, this is now being embraced, in some ways. It feeds into, as other people have written about, kind of neo-capitalist orientation, focus on the individual, just get them to, heal themselves, through therapy or through the use of a drug or whatever, and not think about social context in which, um, people are struggling with PTSD or with depression. What about war? What about the sort of epidemic of loneliness that people are writing about? So there's a way in which, for some, psychedelics helped us to reinforce certain kinds of capitalist tendencies.
But
But I
now
think
it seems we're using it just in like a very controlled setting or for very specific niche use. It's not revolution and and things like that are overarching. It's more, yeah, handling depression or an anxiety or focused on the individual. It's very intriguing to look at that. Maybe same tool but different target.
well, right. Although I don't know what you think. I mean, I don't think that you can manipulate the tool so it's only taking care of a particular symptom, right? It's like
That's a
the
good
tool
point.
is gonna, whether it's gonna help you with depression, but it's gonna, change your whole orientation and, think about how you think about death,
Yeah.
how you think about your ego, or how you think about the profundities of mysteries of life, or whatever. Um, and so that's where I think the revolutionary potential remains,
It's
even
still
as it
there.
is trying to be, um, hampered, and tamped down uh, in clinical settings, and again in this sort of wave of interest around, the therapeutic potentials of it, and that again, that's helping. That's hope. That's opened the door, but now it's like the floodgates. I think are also opening in ways that psychedelic glorification and celebration will definitely spill outside of the boundaries of the clinic or the lab or the others
Yeah.
trial.
Kind of tie dye those whitewashed walls, huh?
Well, right, yeah. I mean, give a little light
Yeah.
in some ways, and
Right.
get real about this. But you know, it's interesting, although to read the critiques of uh, you know maps and some of the current industry of psychedelics and people who use the word cult, like psychedelics and the
uh,
psychedelic sciences. There's like a cult-like quality to it, and that's a heavily negative word, a lot of baggage. You
yeah.
kind of want to stay away from it, and I don't like to apply it, although I don't rule out the word cult as some kind of
There's some
descriptive.
similarities, huh?
Well, and yeah, and it gets to what I'm trying to write about, which is a religious culture that is a part of the psychedelic um, medicine movement, um,
Right.
and that's not like harsh, judgmental. You're brainwashing everyone, but it's more like, let's admit, you know, the, the
There's a
shaman.
significance.
The shaman is the therapist, and the holding hands is the ritual, and
Right.
it's the mystical experience is at the core, but certainly what happens after that experience is also um, tied into kind of religious elements like morality and purpose in life and so on.
Yeah. And how about from the psychedelic side with DMT and the studies and things with DMT and end of life experiences and kind of the correlations between those two things? Does that just more like ring the bell louder on the kind of religious connotations with psychedelics, or does it add a different tone to it to thinking about that?
it's a siren. It's a siren, man.
It's the
It's a
klaxon
not
calling.
even a
Yeah.
tolling of the bell. It's like, I get carried away and probably push this a little too hard, but like, I mean, what else is there besides death? I mean, and what else is there to religion besides death? I mean, I think death is intimately and intricately tied into mortality.
Into human life in itself, right? You can't have life without it.
That's
Kind of
right.
that stoic perspective on death is kind of where I find myself more comfortably trying to just appreciate it, respect that it's there,
Yeah.
not to turn away, right? Or
Well,
forget.
yes. Um, and maybe also recognize that that may change as you get older.
Yes, that's
So
like
yeah, I mean, yeah. Big topic, another class I teach, but like
next
you're
episode,
saying,
right?
what's that?
Next episode, right? We'll go with death only. I know that you have a lot of background in the subject and interest there.
Well, maybe too much, but yeah, I've written a bit on that topic. But
Yeah.
just, yeah, your point is right on. It's all of the, around questions around death and death anxiety, near death experiences. We're seeing how these are also tying into aspects of psychedelia, and and I think this is where I think the medicine of psychedelics shouldn't be limited to just certain kinds of afflictions. I mean, we're all afflicted, by the reality of death, by the reality of suffering. And, I'm not just saying everyone should get whatever drug they want, of course, but I'm just, let's realize that, especially with psychedelics, and their fundamental, foundational usages in pre-Columbian indigenous cultures, um, was was about life, was about sort of existential questions. um, I think, and the healing wasn't just about, let me heal your sore arm. It's about, we got to go to the
The
ancestors.
bigger question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
The real one.
right. And so this too is way where maybe we can see fractures in the biomedical ideology and prison that we've been in for so long, and seeing where the boundaries are getting blurry between medicine, between spirituality, um, and these other often separated, compartmentalized zones that we artificially think again are separate.
Right, right. So these awakenings are sweeping. They aren't they can affect anything. Then if they may be able to change the perspective around death or the approach around such significant life events or the most significant life event.
Yeah, I mean, and that gets back to your other question about like maybe psychedelics more distinctive, in terms of the bigger picture of sacred drugs. I think you're right. You're right, and what you just said is relevant. This class of drugs, what they do, and the experiences that they can lead to, are of a
Right.
different scale. you know, and that um, can collectively, really bring about societal changes, and reorient people in terms of their sort of existential realities and concerns. So
Right. Right.
it's yeah. I mean, I think potentially, there are profound cultural changes that take place as a result of these awakenings.
That's going to be very intriguing to watch unfold over the next several years here. And I
Oh,
know there's little seeds of that already from like 5-MeO DMT. There's some churches and some groups that treat that as a sacrament at this point. There are ayahuasca journeys happening south of the states. It seems in almost every country. It's definitely won't be long before that ripple that they're creating is going to start making a wave.
I agree, and way beyond just this clinical setting, like you're saying, it's really going to,
Yeah.
I think, be part of a larger movement. where people do turn to psychedelics, especially for again some of these sort of deeper, very human uh, needs and concerns and desires.
Right. That have a pretty heavy correlation with the traditional religious needs and desires.
Well, yeah, I mean, that exactly, yeah, absolutely. Because that, again, what does religion do but help us cope with death? What does religion do but help us understand our identity in a larger kind of cosmic orientation? What does religion do to help us make sense of suffering, in the world? And I do. I think psychedelics and maybe other drugs kind of operate in that fashion, and 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 fulfill people in meaningful ways that religion used to do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and is it your interest in religion that led you to the Sacred Drugs book, or did you have a sacred experience of your own, or is it a combination of the two?
Uh, well, I had a definite psychedelic experience. So when I was younger, that got me. That was a seed. It was
Got
planted.
the wheels turning, huh?
Well, I guess, but I never, I never thought it would like take this intellectual direction. Um, but
Ah,
uh,
yeah.
but I think it did at some point sort of plant this sort of curiosity around drugs. And I wrote about that. You can find that on it was in some online little journal that's called Frequencies.
Okay,
And
cool.
it's called, my little essay is called LSD. And I try to actually, this is an earlier version of some of the ideas that I'm discussing here with you, actually. Um, but in a very, again, earlier and not so elaborated form, but tied into my own LSD tripping, as a young teenager. And
Excellent. And I think that only builds the platform for you to have had that experience while trying to make sense of it and explain its potential. I think there are folks that have not, who are in this within the space and adjacent to it. It's always kind of like an undercut, knowing that, like, oh, you've believed this, but you've not tried or you've not experienced it yet. There's something to it there that is maybe more that cult side of it.
well, right, and I hear that too, and see that, and how some of these conversations go around psychedelics. Um, and I especially hear it around this movement to help train psychedelic assistants. People
Yeah,
who
to
get
kind of
trained.
create the neo shaman or the therapist that we need for the revolution to happen. We can't just bring all these generational shamans up from Peru, or find them across the world. And there's more people than that.
Yeah,
The community's larger.
yes, but we can train our own. Or, again, there's some who don't think you need to have the experience and you can still go in and help someone and hold their hand. And then, of course, I think the majority are more, let me go to Denver or let me go to
Yeah,
the Bay Area and get my
a little bit
training.
of facilitation around it.
Yeah, and that, that is part of the industry, but that also contains, as we're talking about, certain kinds of religious possibilities and connections. Whether it's in the
Right.
figure, the shamanistic figure that um, you know gets tied into these new um, therapists' assistants, or um,
I think that's the
again,
danger of it. Yeah, you kind of want to provide that assistance, but try to avoid the title, avoid the authority perhaps that a shaman would have traditionally. In that now it's like, hey, you're Doctor, you're Doctor George, like this is your role, And I think it's psychedelics have a way of maybe confusing that or making it hard to avoid that connotation of like a saving figure or a guide, like a mental Sherpa, the way that these shamans operate and facilitators end up operating, even if it's not intended.
Yes, and there too, I think there are two levels we can identify as where those attitudes really take shape. You know, on the one hand, for the individual who's in training as a facilitator, you know, there is more of an ability to try to kind of control attitudes and get them to think more about their area of expertise or what they're, you know, what they've learned and how they can apply it. Um, but at the more meta level, you know, in terms of the psychedelic movement around therapy and therapeutics, is um, very different symbolic and conceptual landscape that's at work, you know, where I think people are making assumptions that people who are involved in the space are exploiting indigenous communities or are ripping off certain aspects of ritual for the purposes of, you know, this effort to mainstream psychedelics
Yeah,
and there certainly is that going on. I think that that's another tension that is also going to be a part of the larger dynamic of the awakening, is how this more sort of modern form connects to or is separate from more indigenous kinds of activities around sacred drugs. Um, so you know, there's a lot that's in the air that you know is hard to separate around
definitely.
psychedelics.
Clear as mud, right?
And it's very, yeah, there's smog, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I cannot wait to dive into that book, Sacred Drugs. Looking forward to the book itself. Do you have an ETA on it, or a kind of an expected publishing date?
Well, I'm in the process of finishing this last chapter, which is on psychedelics. So this is
Oh,
yeah.
awesome.
So
Yeah,
we're still a little ways off, but I'm plugging away and then hoping, you know, to get it into a press by the end of summer, and then we'll see
excellent,
how
man.
that unfolds.
Definitely. I know that's a journey. And if we could pivot for a few minutes here to the end to Sacred Matters, um, I read Sacred Matters and was blown away by the religious connotations in my own interest in music, my own kind of hobbies and things that I do with comics and games and video games versus board gaming. The communities are different. There's different expectations. It was it was eye opening. I really enjoyed the book, man. And the chapter that I had the most kind of thoughts around was on celebrity. There was a quote that you put in there where society used to worship heroes with ideals, and that it's shifted to heroes based on images with celebrity. I think it came from from another book that was around celebrity.
Yes.
Wanted to get your thoughts on the downward spiral maybe we're on still towards influencers and social media actually basically social media took the first 5 or all the chapters from Sacred Matters and made a monster.
Right.
That's all of them. And so I don't know what your thoughts are on that, or if you've kind of explored an evolution there, like it's kind of, because I think the book came out like maybe right when social media was really like right when the Tinder lit under
Yeah.
it.
Yes. Yes. Well, yeah, it was written, I think 2009 when it came out. So yeah, it's already kind of old. But that's a celebrity chapter. Yeah, seems to get people's attention, and definitely something I explore in teaching. I teach a course now a new course that I've just started called Entertaining Religion, and so
Oh,
it definitely kind of explores some of that terrain. Um, where we try to pick up on social media and some of the changes that have come about. And, you know, there are lots of scholars now who are writing about some of those signs of
yeah,
religious life in media and new media, and how older forms of popular culture, you know, are being uh, transformed as they get processed through social media. Um, so I mean, I think it's the future, or an important spoke in the future, where religious life is really activated. Where religious life finds its expression. Um, as far as the downward spiral, I'm not sure. I think religions always change. And for some people, the change that takes place is sort of a, a degradation or somehow going off course, and other people, will follow the changes
And
and
embrace it.
go
Yeah.
and embrace it. And I and
Right.
I and I'm kind of that mindset where people are going to be religious in all kinds of ways, and they are going to be religious with the tools that are at hand, or the traditions that continue to work. Um, Traditions in our culture no longer continue to work for many people, and and people are going to be religious.
The new traditions will establish themselves whether we like it or not, right?
Well, I think so, and I tried to write about that, as it relates to sports or as it relates to violence, that these
Yeah.
aspects of our culture do pick up these religious perspectives and sensibilities, um, and so yeah, I mean, social media and influencers and just what we're seeing in terms of the cultural impact and the impact on individuals who aren't celebrities, is massive, and is um, something that's going to require a lot more analysis.
There's a lot to unpack there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I again,
That's what I'm kind of worried about, I feel, in that worshiping those idols in some sense is incorrect, as those are, I think, as kind of as the book was sort of hinted on a little bit, kind of empty vessels. Is an image that's just created, not a true ideal, or not, again, going back to like a religious connotation, a saint that to be worshipped, or a more deserved figure in the traditional sense. But maybe that's where traditions change, and now these folks who just build up the image of themselves online are deserving because they've used the new tool kind of and to help establish the tradition.
yeah, yeah, it's a tough call when you really get into some of the vagaries and diversity of forms of religious life, and try to accept that these forms change over time,
Right.
and some don't seem deserving, whether we're talking about something like the religious aspects of the KKK, or some of the craziness we're seeing with Trump and Christian nationalism.
Right.
So, that I may not like it, but the religious power that's operating has got to be accounted for, and I think faced. And even these influencers, whether it's wealth or looks, or I don't know, I don't know if know-how would be something for influencers, but the image part,
Yeah.
that resonates as a sacred value for people. I mean, I mean, whether they're being brainwashed or not is another, maybe another way to go, but there's some
There's
kind
some
of,
sacrality is there still because
well,
of what it's providing.
I mean, I think so.
Yeah.
Even if it's
Very interesting, man.
shaping values, and giving people ideals, even though we might not appreciate them in terms of trying to make a just and fair and happy society. But
Yeah.
this is what I do, is just to try to study this stuff and tease it out a bit.
Sounds like I need to get down to Atlanta and take a class or two one of these days. I'll be
I'll bring you in.
re-enrolling.
I'll bring you in as a guest speaker, man, for sure.
Oh man. Yeah, we'll see. We'll get down there eventually. But definitely, man, I really enjoyed the conversation and thoroughly enjoyed the book. I'm gonna look at Don't Think About Death, and then I'll be watching for this new one, Sacred Drugs, and we'll make sure to bring you back on the once it gets published and dive in a little deeper maybe on the other drugs discussed throughout the book and the rest of it.
Great, I'd love to do that. It's really great talking with you.
Thank you, Gary. And in the meantime, where can folks connect with you and learn more about you and your work?
Well, you can go to the website, just GaryLaderman.com, or find me at the Emory website. Also, found on Threads for the most part, and Instagram. So easy
Excellent.
to get a hold of, basically. And appreciate your interest and the nice things you have to say about the books.
Hey, thank you, man. Have a good day.
Right on. Have a good one too. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Apartment 113 podcast. For more information about the show and our range of services, visit apt113.com. We offer cannabis software product management and agile coaching, along with writing services and weekly content. With over a decade of experience in the cannabis industry, Apartment 113 is here to help. If you want to stay connected, subscribe to the newsletter on our site and to the show on your podcast platform of choice.